So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on today's webinar, where we'll be discussing how and why post-16 education providers can leverage and empower student voices to more effectively tackle the issues impacting their well-being and studies. I'm joined today by some incredible guest speakers. Firstly, we have Jill Burbridge, who is the principal at Leighton Sixth Form College. Jill has been principal there since 2017 and has previously been vice principal for teaching, learning and student achievement. Jill is a passionate advocate for the rights of young people and the role of civil society in helping to better secure life chances and opportunities for genuine political engagement. We're also joined today by two speakers from Leaders Unlocked. Leaders Unlocked, who many of you may know, enable young people and underrepresented groups to have a stronger voice on the issues that affect their lives. Their fantastic work in partnership with FE providers across the country has led to the delivery of a number of powerful student commissions looking at racial justice and sexual violence. We're joined today by Sarah and Caitlin. Sarah is a peer facilitator who works across the Student Commission on Racial Justice and Student Commission on Sexual Violence, and Caitlin is a student at B6 Sixth Form and is a student on the Sexual Violence Commission. I'll let them tell you a little bit more about their work shortly. So thank you for all of you for joining me today. I'll allow you to come back on soon and we'll get into some questions. Get on to that. I wanted to first start by introducing some of the research that we here at Culture Shift have conducted recently, which really is the catalyst for today's session. So for those of you that don't know, at Culture Shift, we're passionate about creating a world of study that is safe, happy, and supportive for students and staff. We realized this goal by partnering with education providers to use our award-winning reporting platform, which gives both students and staff a space to speak up about the experiences that they have faced or witnessed within these settings. To help the sector gain a clearer picture of what these behaviours might look like, we conducted research over the past year, surveying 1,000 students across the country in both rural and urban settings, and holding interviews with over 50 students, talking to them about their perceptions, understanding, and experience of harassment and discrimination in further and post-16 education. Our research showed a number of startling facts, and we will share the link to download that research in the chat. But just to pull out some of the kind of key numbers from that, 49% of respondents had experienced some form of inappropriate behavior, whilst 78% of respondents we spoke to had witnessed some form of inappropriate behavior in school, sixth form or college. There were huge disparities amongst groups. So for example, 53% of women and girl students had experienced harassment and 60% of LGBTQ+ students had, versus 44% of men and boy students and 47% of heterosexual and cisgender students. What our data also showed was that this behavior wasn't isolated. On average, 55% of students believed these behaviors to be common. And this jumps up as you start to look at smaller demographic groups. For example, 73% of the Black, African and Caribbean students that we asked believed these behaviors to be common. Again, huge disparities in the numbers showing how these behaviors are experienced and felt by different populations of the student communities across the country. And in spite of all this, what we saw was only 28% of the students had disclosed details of these behaviors to their school, sixth form or college. So that's just a bit of scene setting, I suppose, to begin the conversation. And what I'd like to start off by doing is inviting Jill to speak to, I suppose, your thoughts on the findings in this report. And you contributed to this report quite greatly, and we spoke at length about your response to these types of issues. So I suppose first and foremost, what were your initial thoughts on the findings and how do they relate to where you see the sector currently in terms of tackling harassment and discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the findings of the report, they didn't surprise me, but they are hugely depressing in many ways. And I think seeing them sort of crystallize within a report like that is always, I think, has that that sort of shock factor of just the enormity of these issues and the number of young people whose lives are affected on a daily basis by both experiencing and witnessing you know, a whole range of behaviours which are harmful in terms of sexual harassment. So it's another very palpable reminder, if we need one, of just how urgent these issues are and how much they need our attention. And I think that in turn links to us as educators, and again reinforces how education more than ever is so much more than what happens in the taught curriculum within our classrooms. We have a really significant role to play in terms of supporting the education of young people around some really key issues, and often there is a kind of intersection. So whether it's around young people's mental health, whether it's around anti-racism, whether it's around sexual discrimination and harassment and violence, or whether it's around things like, you know, the climate crisis and more recently the kind of economic crisis that we're facing. These are big experiences that impact on a daily basis on our young people's lives, and they absolutely deserve and need the support of the education institutions where they are to help them to navigate those. But I'm also, as a college leader, really aware of how stretched our resources are, and actually how, you know, the lack of investment in these areas is really having an impact on how much we can do. And so I feel we're caught in a really problematic dilemma between seeing the urgency of the need and the scale of the need, and a very small amount of resource to meet that need.
Yeah, that's an incredible opening. Thank you, Jill. Two things there that I just wanted to touch on. The first was on the depressive nature of the data. And I think what's important about sessions like this is instilling hope and optimism. And I know that from the work that you're doing and the work that Leaders Unlocked are doing, there's a lot of hope and opportunity for colleges to take away, which leads on to my second point, which is around relating to resource, and how knowledge sharing is a huge opportunity for sharing good practice and how institutions are able to overcome those barriers and say, here, we did this and it worked incredibly well. Not only does that save resource in potentially the actual action, but also just in the time that you're investing into thinking of the solutions. So again, I encourage everybody in the chat today to, as our panelists are speaking, drop thoughts and comments into the chat of, you know, things that you may have done or seen within the sector that you think contribute positively towards the discussion. So I'd like to move over to our other panelists from Leaders Unlocked. And Sarah, I don't know if you'd like to start off with your thoughts on the report, and maybe also contextualize that within the work that you're doing at Leaders Unlocked.
Yeah, so I'm a peer facilitator, so I work very closely with young people in tackling some of the issues that were discussed in the report, as well as like sexual violence or things to do with racial justice. And sort of reading the report, as I said, it very much echoes and reflects a lot of the findings that we found with students as well. But just a personal reflection is that it sort of speaks wholeheartedly, especially with a comment that I seen from Alicia Sloan's in the report, that the themes sort of speak to wider issues in society to do with like archaic norms of patriarchy and racism and homophobia that we constantly still need to fight and immediately need to depart from, so that to make sure that the values and practices that we're instilling in modern day life are reflective of modern day experiences. So moving away from all this, well, back in my day, it used to be like we need to be on top of young people's experiences, the ever-growing nature and changing of, you know, updated modern day life, so that we're still being aware of what young people are constantly going through, especially from marginalized groups of peoples whose voices aren't often heard as much as the sort of like just young people that fit into a stereotype of the norm student. So I really liked how we're focusing on the LGBTQ community, the marginalized and different ethnic community, the disabled voice. I really liked how we were trying our best to hear from everybody, not just a niche amount of people that may have experienced things. That was sort of like my first reflections of the report.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. And you've almost teed me up to introduce Caitlin perfectly there, because of course the report itself in today's session is about leveraging and hearing from the student voice. So we'd be remiss to not have a student speak on today's panel. So Caitlin, thank you for joining us. I just wonder if you want to kick off with any kind of reflections on the data that you had, particularly from a student's perspective.
Well, the first thing that I kind of observed, and it was similar to what Jill said, was that having all of this information down in such like a quantitative form, something that's so easy to see, numbers and statistics and figures, there's no room for interpretation with these statistics, that's just what's happening. It did make it all seem a bit more real, even though I'm in the middle of it quite a lot of the time and I can observe these things happening. It's quite different seeing that they, like, empirically that they do happen, because some of the figures actually, as a person, the environments that I'm usually in, the demographic of my college, for example, are kind of minority led, like the minority is the majority in a way. And seeing that the figures are so much higher among these minority groups, it was a little bit of a shock to me, because I almost don't really consider them to be minority groups, because in the places I'm in, they're not the minority. So it was a bit strange to see that. And then also, I thought it was interesting looking at the section, I've got it up here, the section about what learners said that they expect from their institutions. It seems as though a good number of them, not a majority, not, you know, just like around 30 to 50% of young people seem to know what they want and have expectations of educational institutions. So it did kind of make me wonder that within that information, where's the break in the chain there? Because enough young people seem to know what they expect from these institutions. They want the discipline policy, they want training for staff, and they want all these things and they expect them, but so often they're not there. So it did kind of make me wonder, why is that? Is that because the students that know it they feel like they don't have enough power to say anything? Is it because the staff are choosing not to do it because of shortages in resources, or even just ignorance? I'm not sure that it would be that, because I do know that there are a lot of kind of younger and more educated voices about these issues among these students. There are roles for that in colleges, so I'm sure it's not that, but maybe it could be that. I don't know. It's obviously the data is there, and it's not like there's no reasoning behind it because it's quantitative data. There's no elaboration on any of it. So that was interesting to me also, and also the like I said, the prevalence of these things among minority groups. Whilst not particularly surprising, unfortunately, is still very kind of sobering to read, like on, like, just, it's there, it's tangible evidence that these things are happening. And sometimes you think, oh, well, maybe it happens more between these people and more between these people. But now that you can see it, it's like, oh, this is actually a problem. And a lot of people seem to think that these are kind of archaic issues, like homophobia ended when gay marriage was legalized, or racism ended after the civil rights movement. But clearly they did not, because it's right here in figures, in numbers relating to this specific topic. So that was just really interesting to me.
Yeah, incredible. And I think you've got some applause in the chat there. And you've posed some really important questions. And whilst we can sit and speculate on the answers, I think it's important that those in the audience who work in FE institutions ask themselves that question and ask, where is that, as you put it, chain being broken? And how do you then fix that and repair that communication so that those expectations are being met by institutions? Joe, I want to come across to you. So of course, just over a year ago, we had the Ofsted Rapid Review into sexual assault. And I want to know how that, as a leader of Leighton Sixth Form, how has that impacted your approach to managing student misconduct and measuring its prevalence?
Yeah, there's a short and a longer answer to that. So I'm going to try and do the short answer. I mean, in some ways it didn't, because I think the Ofsted report was very reactive, and it was reactive to things that we already knew, in a sense. I mean, we did a piece of work here which originated out of our sports department and working with some of our particularly female students who studied sport, because that's often a very male environment. And we started a project around both the broader societally the kind of sexual discrimination and harassment in sports settings, but also specifically within the college, and then broaden that out to think about the kind of gendered experience within the institution. That got interrupted by the pandemic, but those conversations were taking place, and we were recognizing through those conversations and the wide research that our students were doing at that point, just how prevalent and normalized these experiences were, and that this wasn't unique to a post-16 environment. That actually a lot of the students that we were speaking to and hearing from, these experiences went back to secondary school, and in some cases in their kind of transition from primary into secondary. So I think in some ways the kind of the Ofsted work on it was sort of, as I say, reactive to something which was already, I mean, the Me Too, and then followed, you know, by Everyone's Invited, you know, that sort of in a sense forced the issue in terms of the kind of, you know, accountability of schools and colleges. So I suppose what it's done, it's given it an urgency, and it's given it a kind of required a structural response from schools and colleges. But I don't think it's fundamentally changed our approach, because I think actually in some ways the sector was ahead of the game in terms of actually, you know, in a sense, Ofsted has told us what we already know. So yes, I think, like with anything that is to do with the kind of formality of accountability, it gives it a kind of greater urgency and a greater visibility. But I'm not sure there was anything in that came as a sort of surprise or you know, forced us to confront something that we weren't already confronting.
Mm-hmm. So then where do you feel the review could have gone further in guiding the sector into action?
Yeah, I think it's the limitations of any report, and I think that the report is hugely welcome and insightful, but it is a starting point, I think, and a kind of springboard for further action and you know, further collaboration around these issues. I think for me, one of the things perhaps we need to understand better, and we need more kind of direction on, is just the impact of social media on our students' lived experience, because I know it can often play a crucial role both in normalizing sexual harassment and violence, but also in kind of perpetuating, so both the content that young people consume, but also the content that they create. And I know from specific cases within the college how much more damage has occurred because things have been shared on social media, and that has widened the damage and made that damage more irrevocable, if you like. And I think, and because it is, I think it was, you know, Sarah who spoke a lot about, you know, we have to respond to the world we are in now. It is no good looking at, it's no good me thinking about my experiences, you know, even though there will be obviously alignment and kind of overlap, we have to look at what is happening now, and what is happening now rapidly changes, particularly when we're talking about technology and social media. And we are behind the curve always, because these things develop and accelerate faster than we can get to grips with them. And there is very little regulation. And so much of this stuff requires other people, and particularly those institutions with statutory responsibility and kind of, you know, government agencies to act, because there is always a limit to what we can do if we're not supported by changes in the law and changes in regulation. So for me, you know, one piece of collaborative work that I would love to be involved in is how do we work between us as education institutions, but also with, you know, those social media platforms, to think about how do we minimize the harm that they do, because they play a part. So human behavior is amplified by what happens, I think, on in social media platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, truth that this is a problem beyond just further education can't be underestimated. It's not an issue that you as a leader and other principals are dealing with in isolation. It moves beyond the walls of further education institutions, which is why the work that Leaders Unlocked do is so important as well. So Sarah, I wanted to come across to you then, and I suppose this might just build on what Jill was speaking about there. But why is it so important to kind of understand the perspectives of students when it comes to building these action plans? Because I know that's the center of the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, understanding student voices is important so that you don't miss a voice, so that no voice is misinterpreted, and that everyone's communication style is different. So we could be focusing on one sect of student voice and adapt and change common practices to meet the needs of one student and completely miss the needs of others. So it's still about being alert, being on top of the changes in society, being sort of, well, this is the work that I do as a peer facilitator, allows me to have access to a whole range of like different types of students from age, backgrounds, different parts of the country, and just really getting insight into what their lives are and what their experiences are, and just being able to not marginalize or not misunderstand what anybody's got to say. So it's important that we reach out to as many students as possible so that we can put things in place to meet the needs of all, not just the needs of some.
Yeah, and just going back to the data that I was touching on in the beginning, you can see how that becomes important, where if you're believing that, only 30% of the students that you're experiencing something, that are 30% of the students within your population are experiencing a certain type of behavior, because you're not looking at the group who are experiencing that twice as much, then your solutions are going to be skewed. Caitlin, do you have anything to add to that, just on the importance of the student perspective in action plan building, and maybe just touching on how you've seen that come to life in the commissions that you've worked on?
Well, I think that generally the students tend to put more importance on these things than kind of institutions, because a lot of the time, well, the secondary school that I was at, I'll use that as my experience, their main issue was the image. So the image of the institution was the most important thing for them. And if something negative happens, then they would deal with it in a way that would most benefit how they looked to other people. Oftentimes that would ignore the perspective of the student. And that, in my opinion, is more harmful in the long run to any institution than trying to protect your image kind of in the moment, because then that student has a negative perception of the institution, and then they go on and spread that negative perspective, and then that kind of spreads out, and then at the end of the day you don't have a positive image to everybody else. And I think that's one of the important things about student-led approaches, aside from that, is that the students are in it. They are the ones who go around every day and observe their fellow students, and they can see these things, because think about it as students would not do a lot of things that they do in the corridors or in the canteen or even outside of school in school groups that they would do inside a classroom. Even if it is within a school environment, if there is a teacher there, they are less likely to do those things. So you could say, oh, but the teachers are in the schools as well. They can see it happening as well, but they don't see the extent of a lot of things that happen. They sometimes could perceive things as being more common or things as being less common, because people tend to kind of amend the way that they act around authority figures. So having the students contribute to kind of these things, the initiatives, is good because it allows a different point of perspective. If the only perspective being considered is the perspective of the people who are the leadership figures, they don't see a lot of the things that happen. So if only their perspective is considered, then it will cut out a lot of the other things that are happening, which is kind of the reason why it's important to have the students there, because you get multiple perspectives, and it's a lot easier to have an actual informed and effective policy be born out of that as a result.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was going to say, just adding on to what Caitlin was saying as well, as part of my facilitation, I always massively encourage the young people to speak on their experience. It's not about being right or being wrong, or what they're sharing with us, whether that fits into the norm or fits into what their own perceptions are, because I think we can all be guilty of wanting to speak based on, you know, what's going to be accepted, to make sure we're fitting into what's right. Or if you have you had any incidents of sexual harassment, and the first thing people are going to think of is what they define as sexual harassment, rather than just speaking on what their actual experience was. So I always tell the young people as well, your experiences are your superpowers. You are an expert based on the fact that you have lived what we are talking about. You have lived this experience. It's not about whether that is the correct category and fits into the term of what you think a certain definition of a behavior is. It isn't. Tell us what you've experienced, and then we'll be able to explore that greater, look up what harm was caused and how we can reduce it and react to that accordingly. And the more we sort of have these conversations with young people in this sphere, we can sort of redefine and broaden what we actually mean by these terms, rather than pigeonholing sexual harassment, racial discrimination, like, because these things are just sort of umbrella terms to define experiences and behaviors. And the more young people speak up about it, the more we can broaden the terms and make sure that we're not only defining this sort of behavior as wrong and this sort of behavior as bad, or this is only racial discrimination, this is only sexual. It's not. It's the more you speak about it, the more we can define harm and react to it accordingly.
Exactly right. And that's beneficial both ways, because our data showed that only 46% of students were able to correctly define harassment. So if they can't define it, if they don't know how to say what it is by the definitions that they're given, then they can't report on it, which goes back to that 28% of disclosure number. But then equally, if you're asking for students to talk to you about set terms and definitions, then anything that to them falls outside of that remit is behaviors that you just don't know to ask the questions about. And we've seen that a lot in higher education. I think there's a lot of similarities there as well, and what Caitlin was saying around. So I think there was an interesting point you made there, Caitlin, around students believing, or the perception of students being, that institutions are there to protect their reputation. And we know that colleges are doing a lot of great work to counter that and to ensure that it's student well-being that's prioritized. But if that's not the perception that your students have of the work that you're doing, then there's a breakdown of communication there. So again, it just goes back to the importance of reinforcing those communication channels. So I just want to move forward then and talk about what's holding students back, do we believe, from speaking to their institutions about their experiences of harassment and discrimination. Again, going to that number of 48% of learners have experienced some form of harassment, but only 28% are disclosing it. What's causing that disparity? And Caitlin, I'll start with you, and then we'll move over to Jill, if that's okay.
Well, a lot of it comes from, in my experience, fear that they won't be believed by the institutions, or just the perception that what has happened to them is not serious enough to be able to be reported. That's something that I saw a lot when I was in secondary school. These incidents would happen, and because everybody would joke about it so much, the victims of the incidents would then believe that their experiences weren't serious enough to be shared to like the teachers, and oftentimes the teachers did find out, and this is an interesting thing that I only just thought of, oftentimes the teachers did find out because they would bring it up in casual conversation. Like the students would just go, oh yeah, you know, there was that one time when so-and-so did so-and-so to me, and then the teachers, it would strike something off in their heads being like, oh, you think that that's normal, and you think that that's like just something that happens, but it's not really. So it's different to a situation of reporting it, being like, oh, something has happened, this is a bad thing, I need to tell someone about it, and it's just become so normalized that you can just chat about it, and that's how the teachers would find out. And oftentimes when something was reported like that, it would be brought up to the safeguarding team, and the safeguarding team would talk to the student about it, and then it would go nowhere because the student didn't think it was serious enough. And that is kind of, there are like kind of the negative aspects of that can be contributed by both the side of the student and the side of the safeguarding team. If the safeguarding team or even just the educators whose job is to educate students, have not properly educated them on the definitions of these things as has been brought up previously, then they're less likely to report it as has been brought up previously. So that is kind of a failing on their side if they haven't expressed the correct kind of situations. And also obviously, like you said, it's difficult because if you give set terms, and if anything falls outside of it, then it may not be considered to be worthy of being reported, and it works the complete other way around as well. And then on the student side, not the individual student who's experienced it, but more of the culture among students, like the rape culture. It's just so common to see these things happen that you don't even think that it's worth reporting. The only positive thing I can see from these situations that I'm thinking of is that there was enough trust between the students and the teachers to just be able to chat about these things, even if you didn't think it was serious. And sometimes, actually, now that I mention it, sometimes they would bring it up in casual conversation as a way of reporting it, but they didn't want it to seem like it was too serious. Almost, it's a difficult thing to categorize in terms of, is it reporting? Is it just being brought up in conversation? But sometimes the students would bring it up in a way that made it seem like they weren't bothered by it, but secretly they were actually asking for help. They just didn't want to seem vulnerable to the other students in the environment. So there are improvements that can be made on both sides there, but I think a lot of it is, to just kind of sum it up, is to do with the lack of education on what constitutes these things. So a lot of the times it can be a lack of trust between the students and the safeguarding team that are designated to be reported to. And then just the normalization of like sexual violence and sexual harassment in schools that makes it diminishes the severity of these things in people's minds and makes them feel like they're not worthy enough to be reported. So
yeah, that's incredibly powerful and almost sad to hear that students are experiencing these things and minimizing them so much that they don't want to speak out about them, largely, especially when, you know, it's because their peers are joking about them. Jo, I want to come over to you and see if you have anything to add on that and on what you believe holds students back, and, you know, how that can be addressed.
Yeah, so I mean, I would absolutely agree with so much of what Caitlin said there, and that would definitely echo the sort of what our students have told us as well. I think that normalization is huge, and that's kind of, you know, multi-layered. So it's both the normalization, so you feel that is just the way things are, that is just how things, you know, there's nothing I can do about it, that is just what it is. But I think also the normalization of the trivialization as well. And I think those overlap. I think there's also, and I've heard this as well from students in the work we've done around anti-racism, there's almost an exhaustion. There is almost I can't keep fighting this. You know, I'm exhausted by it. And so there's the kind of, what's the point? Because however much you listen to me, nothing is fundamentally going to change. So I think that's an aspect of it as well. I think also not always knowing or trusting the support that will be available to you. It can also be a factor. I think also there is a worry that once you have said something, you can't then undo what happens next. So you can't control what will then happen. So there is a fear. So I was working with a young person last year who had been sexually assaulted by somebody who was her friend. And she was hugely concerned about the implications for that individual. So what was preventing her from wanting to do anything more formal was the consequences for that other young person. And she recognised that there would be consequences, and she was frightened of as it were triggering something that then she wouldn't be able to control. But I think there is also a real fear of, will my family have to be told? And that fear of, you know, judgments in the community or within home as well, and that's, I think, an additional factor, and a mistrust of external agencies as well, particularly if it's something that could be a criminal matter. So I think there are all, and that's not helped by the number of media reports of just how victims of and survivors of sexual violence are treated in the courts by the police, you know. So I think there are some clearly inadequacies in terms of the support structures in place within education institutions, but there are also huge issues in terms of those external agencies as well. So I think that those are, you know, some of the key factors. Certainly I've understood from the conversations that I've had with young people, but I do think it's crucial that when issues are reported, you are really understanding what that young person wants to happen next, rather than imposing what you feel should be their next steps, or what you then do with that information. I think, and sometimes it takes a long time for that young person to want to take actual action. Initially, it's often about the support and their immediate needs in terms of feeling safe. And I think pushing young people into, well, you need to report this and you need to do that, is actually quite harmful. That actually, I think young people need to arrive at those decisions in their own time, with the right support and the right information. And again, I think we can do damage by trying to propel young people into action that they're not ready to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on some interesting points there, which I'm going to lead on to my next question. But Sarah, I wanted to know before we move on if you had anything to add to this kind of thoughts on what's holding students back from speaking up.
It's probably not to add, but just to like qualify both what Caitlin and Jill were saying. Just very briefly, I'll just touch on one of my own experiences. But a first year at university, something very similar, like a young boy had been in contact with me. I felt uncomfortable. I think like he fancied me or whatever and wanted to take things further, and I was saying no. He then went onto like social media saying things, I was a temptress, I was a vixen, all this sort of like language that made me feel uncomfortable. I did actually message my tutor about it, and it was sort of trivialized and diminished as childish tittle tattle, what he didn't want to get involved with. And immediately everything that what Caitlin and Jill were saying, it was like, oh well, I felt embarrassed for speaking up. I felt like I wasn't protected or taken seriously. I then spoke to like my closest friends about it, and there was a bit like, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't have said something. And then it then led on to me feeling more uncomfortable in wider spaces. But then my close friends seeing how the education establishment, I guess, dealt with my sort of concerns made them even lesser to want to speak out. And then word gets around the student populations, and don't do that. That's normal. Whatever you went through was childish, it was diminished, it was trivialized, but it didn't take away from how I was feeling at the time, which was fearful of this person. And then to get over that fear, do you then just give in to what the person wants so that you become an accepted part of the student body again, so you normalize it, what's actually happened, rather than trying to nip it in the bud. And again, what Jill was saying about what being conscious about the consequences of what the student would have wanted. Maybe if the tutor would have asked me, are taking it seriously. Oh my God, I can understand how this can be upsetting for you and distressing in your first few weeks of university. How would you like me to deal with it? And I would have probably just said, please, can you have a word from asking to stop? Because maybe being spoken to from a member of authority that takes it seriously would have made the individual realize that it was serious to do that, because you've made a young girl feel uncomfortable and fearful at university. But because that didn't happen, and it was trivialized and then normalized and then made for me to accept and sort of go along with this sort of narrative of who I was now and play into that, it then changed how I then react to that sort of like harm. And any other girls that may have experienced that from the individual or other individuals, it became normalized. So a lot of the things why young people wouldn't speak up is, again, the judgment that it will come from, the trivialization of it, the fear of not being believed, and then just, again, the other impacts. And again, when I've gone back and told my older brother or other male members of my family, and then it's then leading into, okay, street justice now. If education establishments are not going to deal with it, then we will deal with it in our way, which is not what you want. You want to be able to trust that you're protected and looked after by the people that have the job to do so, and not to run into family and friends to deal with it in more, you know what I mean, less favourable ways.
No, absolutely. Firstly, thank you for sharing your experience. I think it's always powerful hearing how these situations play out in real life examples. So thank you for sharing that with us. And you touch on a really interesting point around the reliance that we have then on members of individual staff, whether that be tutors or kind of your support staff around the building, to be that first responder to students when they are making a disclosure, whether that be with the intention of making a report, or as Caitlin said before, just mentioning something lightly, looking for support, but not wanting to make it seem that they're looking for that help and support. And you can't always control how those situations play out, particularly if the training and the resources that you have to amplify that training aren't broad enough to stretch across your whole team, which is why our system gives that one point of consistency for students to be able to report into. But it touches on this idea of safeguarding, and we know that that's a vital kind of element within teaching and support in post-16 education, and it does an incredible job of ensuring that there are trained members of staff across the student community who are able to notice and respond to these kind of student safeguarding issues. But Jo, I wanted to come over to you and see if there's anything that you've noticed, any positives in your work that with students that you feel you might not have been able to kind of actualize if you relied only on your safeguarding strategies.
Yeah, so I think for us, it's over the last few years, there's been very much a recognition that all young people have safeguarding needs by virtue of being in that age group, because they are exposed to more risk and more vulnerability, and also have less resource and less recourse to address the injustices and the exposure to risk that they face. Whereas as adults, you know, you have often more financial resource and also more capacity to access those systems that should be able to protect you. Whilst I accept that there are, you know, still, you know, depressingly high incidents of domestic violence and things like that happen to adults, it is you know, it is different. So I think recognizing that all sort of 16 to 19-year-olds, of course, the students that we work with potentially have safeguarding needs is vital, because otherwise it becomes a kind of specialist provision for people with the highest need and at highest risk. And I think that can mean that a lot of students don't get the support that they need, because they don't feel, and again it goes back to that normalization and that trivialization, they feel that's not for me, I'm not, you know, I'm not sort of, my need isn't as great as the kind of, you know, what they perceive the sort of safeguarding kind of department to deal with. So one way in which we've addressed that is, first of all, we've just expanded our team. And we also work with other staff who have different roles in the college. So we have a youth worker, for example. It's a shared resource. So somebody who acts as a youth chaplain at a local church, but we half of his time is spent with us, and he is somebody who creates some safe spaces for students to share their experience. We've got a social action apprentice who works, they are employed by us, but they work across a number of other colleges, including B6, and again, creating spaces for students to share their experiences. We do the work that we do with wonderful organisations like Leaders Unlocked, who again help us to create those platforms and those spaces, but not just to hear student experience, but to create action for students to be involved in. We're also really clear with our staff that the well-being and safeguarding of students is everybody's responsibility. All of our staff have had things like trauma-informed training on a regular basis, and being able to identify shifts in students' behaviour and being able to be the first responder if students disclose something, or where they identify that there may be something that a student wishes to disclose. That is different from staff being able to then be the person that then manages that going forward, but it's being able to be the first responder and then knowing how to signpost that expertise and that ongoing support for students. But I think it's that kind of taking safeguarding away from just the specialists that you have. And whilst they will be the people that obviously will facilitate that ongoing work, everybody needs to be able to respond, and everybody needs to be able to provide that kind of safe adult, that adult of trust. And we have, I mean, for example, our security team are wonderful, and they often will be the people that some of our students will go to because they feel that they're the people that they can tell. And so, you know, on a weekly basis, I will get something that's reported into me by one of our security team who said, look, I just want you to know this young person said this to me, and you know, I've agreed with them that they'll come and talk to you, and I'll be with them. And so it's you know, and that's not their remit, but they provide that service to students because something about the way they interact with our students, they're seen to be a safe person to talk to, and to be able to confide in. And we have all sorts of people like that across our college. So I think that's key when resources are really stretched, and we have expanded our specialist team and we've rebranded them as safeguarding and well-being, student well-being, because we think that might feel more inclusive to students based on the feedback that we got from our students, that actually safeguarding can be an off-putting term. So actually they felt that if it was called well-being, they were more likely to engage with that service. So we've done that, but we've also tried to ensure where possible that every member of staff can feel confident enough to, if they're approached by a student or if they recognise a change in students' behaviour, that they're able to respond in that moment, because that's the crucial thing, is being able to respond in that moment. You may not have the expertise to then work with that young person going forward, but you need to feel that, you know, you have the confidence to listen and to be able to respond in that moment. I don't know if that's answered the question, sorry.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. Thank you, Jill. We're running into the last minutes of the session now, so I just want to touch on, before we see if there are any questions, how we go about doing all of this. So how do we amplify student voices, and in particular what are often the quietest voices amongst student populations? So Jill, let's come straight back to you on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's really hard. So we've got about 2,300 young people in our organisation. And I think for us, it's about really knowing those young people. Now, I can't know all of them, but I need to know that there is at least one member of staff that knows every student, whether it's the tutor, whether it's the classroom teacher, you know, whether it's our youth worker, or whether that those young people are very, you know, they are known, they are seen, they are visible, they are valued. And that's really important, because young people will not have the confidence to speak unless they feel that they are seen and that they are recognised and that their voice is valued. So I think it's ensuring that there is that relational practice is built within the college. It's also creating platforms for students to share their experience and have their voice heard, and for other students to recognise, therefore, that you can do that, that actually what you have to say is really important, and it can bring about change. So we work in lots of different ways. I mean, the work we do with Leaders Unlocked is incredibly powerful. And I think in answer to your question, one of the things that we can do is to keep investing in that work that brings institutions together and then enables young people to get round the table with the people who can have the power to make change. Because, you know, we need those big statutory bodies, those government departments, you know, those, you know, that they need to hear those voices, they need to take them seriously, and then they need to act on them in the way that young people feel they need to be acted on. Because that, it's only, we can make localized change, obviously, but for this to really make a difference, because I want my students to not just feel safe within the walls of the college, I want them to feel safe on the bus home. I want them to feel safe in their local park. I want them to feel safe when they go to the cinema, or they go to, you know, a youth club, or, you know, they go into a shopping centre. I want them to feel safe in their life generally. And I can't do that. I can help to make the environment within the college and within our local streets as safe as possible. But I can't, you know, I have no influence on some of the spaces in which our students inhabit. But, you know, young people absolutely deserve the right. Nobody should feel, and, you know, I talked to, you know, that nobody should feel unsafe going about their day-to-day lives, whoever they are. And that's something that, you know, we need to make very, very clear demands on our political leaders to make those changes.
Yeah, that was incredibly powerful. Thank you, Jill. Sarah, I want to come across to you, and then hopefully we can get Caitlin in before we run out of time, just on how we can continue to amplify those student voices.
Very briefly then, I would also say, as much as it's really imperative to know the young person, it's just as imperative to know yourself and how you come across, because your communication styles may not match the needs of the young person as well. If you're an extroverted personality, if you come across quite loud and, oh, come on, just tell me everything, and just sit down and get to know, like, that might be overbearing from a young person. Some young people might a little bit more introverted and quieter, but as long as you know yourself, you're self-aware, you know how you can come across, you can communicate what your intentions are for the young person. And if that doesn't help, signpost them to the person that can help, that may match what their need is as well. As much as you were trying to know the young person, you need to know how you are also coming across to other young people as well. And if you're not able to adapt to who you are and your personality and how you come across to young people, signpost to who can. And then a second point, and that is although I liked the point where Jill was saying about language being important, and sometimes when you move away from the word safeguarding into well-being, and when I speak with young people, I sort of use the word helping each other and being mindful and respectful of each other. Peer-to-peer safeguarding can also be amazing when each other, all the other students are aware of the other needs of each other and can help each other. And then that's when you're getting other students coming to you as a safer person, saying, oh, miss, I think this person may struggle with a little bit, and you see the side eyes and the thank you for that, because you've got each of the peers between themselves helping each other, safeguarding. It's a lovely cohesive working environment where everybody is self-aware, they're aware of the other people in the room, and people are being respectful of each other's learning styles and learning needs, and where people, you know what I mean, just creating a nice cohesive environment of people being self-aware and working together. So peer-to-peer safeguarding, and also being aware of how you come across to other young people.
Thank you, Sarah. Caitlin, anything that you'd like to add in and close on there?
Yeah, just quickly, I think I agree with a lot of the things that have been said already, especially with the kind of the terms of like safeguarding and like, you know, all of those words. Sometimes those words, I'm not sure if this is just a personal experience. Well, I know it's not just a personal experience, but because I've heard the same things being echoed from some people that I've spoken to before. But safeguarding as a term, it feels a little bit serious. You know, obviously it is serious because that's what's needed. There is a definite requirement for very carefully considered safeguarding in colleges and stuff. But sometimes if something has happened to someone, they go, oh, you need to go to the safeguarding team. It's like, it feels a bit patronizing almost, and I don't really know how you would fix that. I think that's more of a mindset issue among some of the people that I've spoken to. But when you say to them, oh, you need to go to the safeguarding team, you need to speak to a member of staff, it makes it a lot more serious for them, and that can sometimes impact the way they think about the situation. Maybe it's not worth all the trouble, you know, I have to go to the safeguarding team, you know, the big bad safeguarding team. And if you're not already familiar with the people in the team, then you'll think, oh, I'm bothering these random people that I don't know with my issues. Maybe it's not that serious. Maybe I shouldn't go and talk to them. Maybe I should just keep it to myself. So I think, again, a lot of this has been said, but just kind of encouraging familiarity with the staff, making sure that they're not too overbearing almost, because like, I think it was Sarah that said that if the staff are too like that, then it's like, whoa, I don't like, I was just talking to you. If they're too enthusiastic, it kind of makes them seem like they're trying a bit too hard, and then that kind of creates an uncomfortable situation for both of them, because the staff member is trying too hard and the student is like, what are you doing? So that can happen quite a lot. And then also just making sure that there are other ways of reporting these things that don't necessarily involve speaking to people straight off the bat, like forms, online, it doesn't have to be anonymous, but like online reporting, it can be anonymous if you want it to be anonymous, if that's what it takes for you to kind of report it. And then also, I think students should be told that you can tell people who aren't like members of staff, almost like you can confide in with your friends about these things if you feel comfortable enough to confide with your friends. I know a lot of times these things happen before, where somebody has experienced something and they've told one of their friends, and their friend has gone, right, I'm going to go to the safeguarding team, I'm going to tell them for you, because they care about their friend and they want them to feel supported in a way that makes them comfortable. So just kind of encouraging those things, I think, is really important for reporting and stuff.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And you make incredible points. And just to kind of bring this to a close, of course, all of the issues we've spoken about have been incredibly important. Some of the tactics and tools that you're using through the student commission work and through the work that you're doing at Leighton Sixth Form College, Jill, is going a long way to encouraging students to speaking up in ways that they feel safe to do so. And of course, the work that we do here at Culture Shift, offering that reporting platform and that place to speak up, either, as Caitlin mentioned there, anonymously or not, is a way of overcoming some of these barriers. So giving students a way to speak up in a way that doesn't further minimize their experience, doesn't include the potential bias or negative response, or the unideal responses from people that can sometimes creep their way in, particularly where people aren't trained as first responders. For more information on our reporting platform and what we do, please do get in touch with myself or the team. I'm Kenya. You can find me at kenya@culture-shift.co.uk. We also have Polly on the call, who you can contact at polly@culture-shift.co.uk. And we'd be happy to answer all of your questions on the reporting platform, on the data that we've shared in the report. Please do download and read that. Hopefully there's some useful insights, but also some guidance and advice on overcoming the issues we've been speaking about today. So thank you for those that have taken an extra 2 minutes of your time of today. It's been incredible speaking with you, Caitlin, Sarah, and Jill. So thank you also for your time, your knowledge, your insights, and your shared stories and experiences. And I will call the session to a close there. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.